Well, welcome everybody. This is Captain Dan Blanchard of Uncruise Adventures, inviting you to join me for no ordinary adventure. And this is a time when I get to spend with some of my favorite people in the industry and outside the industry to talk about just really cool stuff. Sometimes it's about travel, sometimes it's about wildlife, sometimes it's even about cruising with Uncruise. Imagine that. But today I have one of my favorite people on planet Earth, Amy Gulick. I've known Amy for a long time. I don't know how long.
I think 15 years.
Probably 15 years. And Amy is renowned for her books, one of which, her new one, is right here, A Salmon Way. And Salmon in the Trees, of course, is my favorite. Not only because it's probably your first. Fair enough.
Yep.
And I remember, Amy, sending you, I think I was with my daughter and maybe Megan, and we were at Limestone Inlet, and we were tromping up right in the middle of a combination humpy pink salmon run with a few cohos mixed in. And we were going through this dense forest on the stream at Limestone, and literally salmon carcasses everywhere. It stunk to high heaven, and it was dense forest, so we were doing our bear calls. And I made a video and I sent it to you, and I still have that. I still look at it all the time. So you're very impactful.
I have to say I was very touched by that, because it's like, okay, I love it when people are traipsing through this wet, drippy forest, and there's just salmon guts and carcasses everywhere, and it smells, and there's like bear poop all over the place, and then they think of me. Well, it's like, I'm so touched by that.
I think it's apropos. I mean, you're really the person that I think brought to light the importance of kind of the greater ecosystem, but really how it boils down to right where salmon are spawning and what happens with their body. I mean, maybe to start out with, where did this interest germinate from? How did that ever start with you?
Right. Well, I was wanting to do a book, and a more in-depth book, really on the Tongass National Forest of Southeast Alaska. And this is a place, as you know, that really at that time, I think, needed a new story. Not that the old story was, a bad one. It just needed a new oomph and a new way to kind of look at this place in a holistic way. Mm-hmm. And so before setting out to, start to photograph and start to interview people and, to put this whole book together, I was doing some research just on the area, and I came across this really, really dry scientific paper. And the title, here's the title of the paper: The Upstream Flow of Marine-Derived Nutrients in a Terrestrial Environment. That was the title. I almost stopped because I'm not a scientist. I'm an avid naturalist, but I'm not a scientist, and scientific papers are written for scientists. And I almost stopped. It's like, oh boy, this doesn't sound very interesting. But something compelled me to dig in and get through it. And I struggled, and I got through it. And at the very end, this big light bulb went on. I'm like, do you mean what you're trying to tell me is that there are salmon in the trees? Because if that's what this paper is trying to tell me, then that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. And I have to go and photograph this and document it and spread this message to the world, because I don't think a lot of people understand how it is that there are salmon in the trees in Southeast Alaska, coastal British Columbia, and probably many years ago down here as well in the lower 48, Washington, Oregon, Northern California. Because I know everyone's like, oh, well, how is it that there are salmon in the trees? So I'm glad you asked, and I'll tell you. So salmon, for those of you who may not know, they're born in freshwater streams and rivers. They head out to the ocean to mature, and then they return to their birth streams to spawn the next generation. That in and of itself, to me, is unbelievable.
So cool.
That they come back.
Yeah.
Not only to the river, the stream where they were born, but usually to the exact same place in that river or stream. These are remarkable creatures. So when they come back, and in Southeast Alaska, there's more than 5,000 salmon spawning streams throughout the entire Tongass National Forest. Millions of wild salmon are coming in, all kind of at the same time. This area has one of the highest densities of both brown and black bears in the world, in part due to all of those salmon. So when the salmon come in, the bears are there, and they are ready, and they're hungry, and they're all kind of congregating together. But bears don't really play well together. They're not social animals, but they'll somewhat tolerate each other's presence when the food supply is that plentiful. But the bigger dominant bears are the ones that are hanging out like right in the middle of the stream. They've got the best fishing spots, and they're planted there and they're not moving. It's the other bears that are trying to get in and get fish and, not get in the way of these cranky, dominant bears. So they'll come in, grab a fish, and take it into the woods. And that's how all of these fish end up on the forest floor. And over time, the bodies of the salmon all decompose into the soil, and the nutrients in the bodies of the salmon get absorbed through the trees. And here's the aha light bulb moment for me. It's like, I love
this.
I know. I think it's really easy for us to understand, okay, fish fertilize the soil, right?
Sure.
That's really cool right there. But the really cool part is that scientists, they've gone in, they've done tree core samples, and they've analyzed what's actually in the trees. And they found ridiculous concentrations of what's called nitrogen-15. And this is a nitrogen variant that comes from the ocean. It's like 70% of all nitrogen in streamside foliage by these salmon streams is of ocean origin, which means it's coming in the bodies of the salmon. Yeah. So there are actually really salmon in the trees. That's how it works.
It's a wonderful thing. And I think that you are the first one, in my mind anyway, that actually put that whole scientific concept and reality into words that we could all understand and enjoy reading, I will add.
Right.
Because it's, as a salmon person, I grew up in Mukilteo here, and when I was a kid in Mukilteo in Washington State, we had a vibrant commercial fishing community. I remember in high school, I was hired to basically go down to the boats when they came in and jump in the hold, and would have salmon up to my chest almost, as we then, picked them out with a pick and into a bucket, which then went to a processing plant. Of course, today they use vacuums, and much better for the salmon, actually. But, it's remarkable to me, as much as you have learned about salmon, that we're still struggling on bringing salmon runs back. I mean, for you and me, and I think for the rest of the world, we think of Northern California, Washington, Oregon, and primarily Alaska. But yet, it wasn't that many years ago that salmon were still in the United Kingdom, that salmon were prevalent on the East Coast, and where the Columbia River, before the dams, was the biggest watershed ever on planet Earth for salmon.
Yep.
That just brought a bunch of goosebumps.
I know, it does to me too.
So, I mean, a little bit on what you've learned about salmon literally in the trees, and what does that mean for an ecosystem that works for salmon, and maybe why they're not working in other areas?
Right, exactly. I mean, so once you understand this connection between salmon and trees, in Southeast Alaska, again, where it is still very much connected, you only really have to understand that one connection to understand really that whole ecosystem. And you can't help but then start asking questions. It's like, okay, so if there are salmon in the trees, and the way I just described it is that's the way that they actually get into the trees. So what happens if we overfish the salmon or block the salmon's passage, into their spawning grounds? Like, what happens to the forest? What happens to the future of salmon? What happens if we cut down all those trees along the stream? How does that affect the fish? What happens if there aren't any bears? I mean, the bears are the UPS FedEx delivery men, that are delivering. I mean, they are largely responsible for getting those salmon out of the water and onto the land. Yeah. So what if the bears aren't there? So you start asking all these questions, and what you're doing is really you're looking at all of these links, these pieces of this puzzle that's complete. It's like I call it the circle of life. So if we start removing one piece here and one piece there, that whole circle unravels. To me, salmon they're such an indicator species too, because they're one of those species that they need everything. They need it all. They need fresh water, and the fresh water has to be healthy, which means the land around that fresh water has to be healthy. They need the ocean because that's where they're bulking up. and maturing into adults. So the ocean has to have enough food. It has to be the right temperature. And then back into their birth streams, their spawning streams, that has to be the right temperature. It has to be just the right amount of water at just the right time. I mean, climate change is kind of starting to mess with the timing of everything and the temperature of everything and the acidity. So I always like to say that if salmon are healthy, then we can be too, because we all need the same things that they do.
Yeah.
But if salmon are in trouble, then to me that indicates that we're in trouble too, whether we think we are or or not, or we're not aware of it. Salmon can't get to their spawning grounds. Why? Is there a dam in the way? Has the river been so dredged and altered that it's not even recognizable anymore?
Yeah.
Or there are culverts, there are roads going over all these salmon streams, and the salmon just can't get up like over a road, anymore. There's all kinds of things that could impact salmon's ability to move really between their freshwater life and their ocean life.
Yeah.
But they need it all, but we need it all too.
We do. It's kind of ironic in a way that we're sitting here talking at our fisherman's terminal office in Seattle, where this whole terminal was built really for salmon and halibut, and primarily salmon though back in the day. And when I was a kid, my dad used to joke when we'd come down here from my home in Mukilteo, where I grew up. He would talk about, Danny, I actually fell in the water once as a 4-year-old. My dad hauled me out and he said, "Hey, Danny, don't worry about it. You could have walked across this," because it was so polluted, right? And then in recent years, there's been a big effort by, I think it's the Friends of the Cedarwater Rivershed or something like that, there's a recognition that copper in water is like detrimental, and it was coming from brake shoes on cars. I mean, I think this fits in with everything about a really sensitive species that doesn't adapt well to human conditions.
Right.
Is that fair?
Right. Yeah, I mean, they are sensitive, but then at the same time, they're so hardy and they're so tough and they're so resilient. But they have to have the freshwater and the saltwater, and all of that has to be healthy. If they have that, they will keep doing what they have been doing for millions and millions of years. I mean, when you think about like the evolution of salmon and how far back they go and what they have survived, they've survived ice ages. They've survived volcanic eruptions. They've survived drought, forest fire. They're just incredibly hardy. But I think, we're at a point now where it's up to us to give them what they need.
Amen, sister. Preach it.
Yeah.
And that reminds me, it is up to us, because the salmon can't make this happen on their own, obviously. But I'm reminded of when you and I worked together along with some really other great organizations to basically assure that the Tongass was saved, the Tongass National Forest, and the largest temperate rainforest left in the Northern Hemisphere, I believe. And it's 17 million acres, I think, and all the streams you talk about. But there was a time recently where the roadless rule was going to be removed from the Tongass, which would open up more wholesale industrial logging and other things. Do you want to talk about maybe a little bit about the Tongass and your part and our part as a community and making sure that rule was maintained?
Sure. I remember, going way back now. So that rule, the roadless rule, which protected 60 million acres in various national forests throughout the entire country. And those acres are roadless. So there's not roads built in them. And they have not been logged, developed, mined, grazed on, like in any way. So 60 million total throughout the country, 9 million of which are in the Tongass National Forest.
Yeehaw!
Yeah. So
God, that makes me feel good.
I know, right? Sometimes we win.
Sometimes we win.
We have to celebrate when we do. And this was a big one. But I remember when the public hearings were going on for the roadless rule. It was back in like 2000, because it got passed in 2001. That's now 22 years ago.
Yeah.
But in that time, when it went into effect in 2001, ever since then, it's been this political ping pong match. It's like, okay, we're removing the Tongass protections. Now we're putting them back in. Now we're removing the Tongass, but now we're putting them back in. And it, just kept going back and forth, as these things tend to do. But in the last, let's see, when the Trump administration came into office, it's like, okay, roadless rule is we're revoking it from the Tongass, and then that kind of timed out, but they did succeed in doing it. And then the Biden administration came in and they started the process, because all these things are a process, right?
Right.
Started the process to reinstate the roadless rule in the Tongass. As of January of 2023, it is now reinstated. So it's like, whoosh, we can breathe a sigh of relief for a while.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like anything. What do we need to do to make sure this isn't just at the whim of a few people who want to see all of this opened up and really, in my mind, and destroyed. And destroyed not just for the salmon, not just for the trees, not just for the bears, but the people and the native people who've lived there for thousands of years, and their entire culture revolves around the forest.
Yeah.
Being healthy.
Yeah.
And being able to provide. And then, operators like yourself, the communities, people who live there. I think what was really heartening for me over the last 22 years was to see how much more and more support there was for this roadless rule. Because I think at first, I don't know if people really understood the impact, like what it was really going to mean. But over that, the last 20 plus years, more and more, it was like, 95% support to protect that forest as much as we can.
Yeah,
and that's more than it's ever been.
Oh, it's exceptionally high. And what was interesting is the Forest Service did all their listening sessions. And I believe it was like 85 or 90% of all comments from residents of Southeast Alaska was to keep the roadless rule or mildly modify it. And so that's a big change from 2000,
It is a big change.
when it was generally seen as intrusive. But I think people realize that, okay, there's a reason we don't have salmon on the East Coast. There's a reason why the salmon runs on the Columbia River are almost nothing. Mm-hmm. And I think people, we know from being in the visitor industry that people don't come to Southeast Alaska to see a clear cut, an industrial logging. They don't come to see, all the different activities that can harm salmon runs. Mm-hmm. They come to see wild nature, which is so rare in our world.
Yeah.
I'm just continually, and I know I keep bringing it up, but to me, it's just unfathomable that all these places in our world had salmon at one time. And I have to just share a quick story with you. I first started running on the Columbia River as an operator in the early 80s as a captain. And I remember sometime around 1983, my mom was probably in her early to mid 50s. I came home and saw her, and she asked me, "Did you see the falls?" And I said, "Well, yeah, there's a lot of falls down there." She goes, "No, the big one on the river." And I said, "No, I'm not sure what you're talking about, Mom." And I was actually kind of thinking, "Are you losing your marbles, Mom?" But she was talking about Celilo Falls.
Oh, wow.
And it ends up that she shares the story of how her grandfather, she came from a really abusive family, but her grandfather was the one good man. And he took her and her brother down on the Columbia and Snake River in a car in the early 30s when they were just little children. And she remembered seeing Celilo Falls before the Bonneville Dam was built. And I'll tell you, she just bawled. She just, this is going to get me emotional.
It is me too.
It took her, she couldn't, somehow she didn't know the name of that. And even though she knew dams were on the Columbia River, she had no clue. I mean, why would anybody ever take out a falls like that? It was just a wonder of nature. And she just bawled when I told her that, what your grandpa took you to has been gone for decades. And that is one of the reasons, many reasons, why we don't have the runs that we traditionally had. Sure, it makes power. Sure, it can be navigated now. There are pluses, but what it's done to salmon has been devastating.
Yep. Exactly. I know. I think of Celilo Falls, and it just and you know, when you see historical photos of that, and again, it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, and for people listening, that Celilo Falls have been underwater since the Bonneville Dam was built in, I can't remember what year, 38 or something. Yeah, just prior to World War II.
Yeah.
And
and you know, the tragedy about all those dams to me is like we knew what salmon needed. It's not like we were ignorant of this.
Yeah.
We knew exactly where salmon needed to go, you know, to spawn and keep that whole wonderful, beautiful life cycle going. And as far as I am aware, they were actually supposed to have fish passage built into those dams, like they were mandated to do it, and they just didn't do it.
yes.
You know, and that story has been repeated, you know,
Over
in
and over.
Europe and on the East Coast of the United States, and you know, here as well. There are now salmon ladders on some of those dams, but there's so many dams.
Well, and
They just can't.
how effective they are has always been a question.
Exactly.
And, you know, that there is a hardy part to the salmon. I mean, you know, they've been barging salmon downstream, which is crazy, but the water's too warm, and because of the pools that are created. But I agree with you. Salmon are a hardy species. I think people believe that all salmon return to that exact space, but we know now through research that 2 to 3% kind of go rogue.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
straight.
in Glacier Bay, where you and I have both spent a lot of time, some of the streams that even when we were young that had no salmon have salmon today.
Wow.
Because they've receded after the ice has left. I mean, talk about adaptive.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Especially the pinks.
Oh, the pinks get it right in there. They'll practically spawn in salt water almost.
Right.
Brackish anyway. Yeah. We brought up really good subjects about, you know, some of the things that salmon need. There's probably things we don't fully understand, but we pretty much do understand what they need. We've talked about, you know, the importance of why those salmon carcasses go into the why bearers take them, why it is so good for bringing in nutrients to the soil, which then again, they get the whole ecosystem just on frickin' fire.
Yeah.
And, and we talked about the Tongass and how for now anyway, we've had success. But in your mind, and I think this kind of goes a bit into your next book, The Salmon Way, it's not only a lifestyle in the past, but for many of us, salmon is a lifestyle today, both in wild nature and in food product, because it's so sustainable. What's the path forward here? What are we going to do? Amy, what the hell are we going to do the rest of our lives to assure this continues in a positive manner?
I'm glad you asked that question. And you're right. I think it does kind of go into to the latest book, The Salmon Way. And the reason why it's called The Salmon Way is every single person I met with, this book is very people-centric, and it celebrates and explores the relationships that people throughout the state of Alaska, not just Southeast, but Southeast is a big part of it, but throughout the whole state had with salmon. And so my whole goal was to meet with the greatest diversity of people I could throughout the parts of the state where salmon are prevalent.
Yes.
You know, so I met with indigenous people whose, again, entire cultures and ways of life have been built by salmon and sustained by salmon for thousands of years. I met with commercial fishermen who catch and sell salmon. I actually crewed on a troller boat, which talk about a greenhorn.
Yeah.
But, you know, I felt like, hey, well, you know, what's commercial fishing like? And then I met with sport fishing folks, whether they are guides or lodge owners or just recreationists themselves. So just try to get an idea. Okay. And the thing is, I asked everybody the same question. Basically, you know, what is your relationship with salmon? Tell me what salmon mean to you. And after several years of traipsing all around Alaska and salmon country and asking pretty much that basic question to as many people and a diversity of people as I could, I came back. And putting together a book, I have to say, is like this massive undertaking. You know, I had tens of thousands of photographs. I can't even tell you how many hours of interviews I had. So,
oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, at that point, you're just kind of like, oh my gosh, how am I gonna synthesize all of this and make something compelling? So I transcribed all the interviews and I typed them up, printed them all out, and I spread them all across a floor. And again, I was really overwhelmed. And I was just like sitting in this sea of paper and words and like, oh my gosh, like again, how am I gonna put this together in a way that's compelling? And I just started, again, I was really overwhelmed, and I just started like picking up paper and just kind of looking at words. I wasn't looking at the name at the top and who these people were. I was just picking up paper, and words kind of started just glowing and kind of popping out. And I just started highlighting words, and then I'd put it down, and I started doing that with all of them. And I started looking at all the highlighted words, and I realized everyone's telling me the same thing. It didn't matter if they were, again, indigenous people, commercial fishermen, sport fishermen. Salmon mean the same thing to everybody. So the answers were things like family, community, culture, well-being, my connection to the land, my connection to a home stream, this very valued way of life, passing this all on to my kids and my grandkids.
Yeah.
Universal human stuff, straight from the heart. And I don't know why at the time, I was really surprised by that. I think I thought that everybody's relationships, because the people themselves were so different, I thought their relationships were going to be very different too. And they really weren't. I mean, like maybe what they do with salmon and how they interact with salmon might be a little different. But what salmon meant to them was exactly the same. And I just, again, had this kind of aha, eureka moment. It's like, oh my gosh, this is the salmon way. Like this is the salmon way of life for everybody who has a relationship with salmon. And this word relationship, this also came out in my research, and I really want to emphasize this to people, because I always say, if there's one thing you remember or take away, like from any kind of talk I might give, particularly on this book, it's the difference between the word relationship and resources. Because so often you hear, oh, salmon are a resource.
Right.
The Tongass National Forest is a resource. What else? Something else is, whatever it is a resource. And it's like, no, this is a relationship. It's like a resource to me, like that's a commodity. Like a resource is frozen fish sticks or timber, a 2x4, or copper tubing that comes out of a mountain. But you can't have a relationship with a fish stick or a piece of copper tubing or a 2x4. But you can have a relationship with the things that those things came from. So the forest, the salmon, the mountain, the ocean, whatever. So it's just so crucial to me that people understand the difference between resources and relationships. And so I always encourage people, when you find that word resources starting to roll off your tongue, try and catch yourself and replace it with relationship and watch your mind do a complete shift.
Yeah.
Because I started out using the word resource, and it was actually a native woman who corrected me and just said, salmon are resources. The trees aren't resources. We have relationships with those things. And just as she was telling me her stories and what her relationships are, my whole mind just shifted. And it's like, why haven't I been thinking about things in terms of relationships? And why isn't really our whole society, thinking in terms of relationships? Because when we think in terms of commodities like are things that we take, and they're things that we extract.
Yeah. And
when you take and you extract, that's not a reciprocal deal.
Yeah.
You're not giving something
I would agree. I would even add the term industrial to that.
Yeah. Oh, for
it's
sure.
like when it becomes a commodity, or let's say a flight scene with seaplanes in Southeast Alaska compared to taking a Delta trip. I mean, that's a commercial, industrial commodity, right?
Yeah.
And you have this little experience on a float plane. Mm-hmm. I kind of look at those kind of similar in the way we measure them.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And, we think of any relationship, right? Like what's the basis for a healthy relationship? And that's respect, on each other's part, and this mutual taking care of. And so, everybody I met who is, has a relationship with salmon, they are harvesting salmon in some way and doing something with it. But they feel this great responsibility to give back.
Yeah.
And for them, giving back is making sure that the salmon have what they need. So taking care of the salmon because the salmon are taking care of them. And it's this beautiful, I do get teary when I think about it. It's this beautiful relationship that's really, I think, been severed in so many other parts of salmon's historical range. And so when you don't have that relationship anymore, how is your life impacted? And I think down here in the lower 48, we don't even really know, right? We don't even really know what we've lost anymore. And I don't think we know that we're kind of walking around here, whether we're in the forest or along a former salmon spawning stream or even out in the ocean. Maybe we're not intellectually aware of what's missing, but I still think deep down in our DNA, we do know that something's wrong. And we do know that this relationship is either non-existent anymore or it's just been so degraded and weakened.
Yeah.
But where it's strong, again, and this is why I made the book, not to depress people, but to celebrate the fact that these relationships are healthy, they're thriving, and people are very aware of this gift. And this is the other word that I always want people to take away too, that salmon are an incredible gift, and they're a gift to the land, the water, the wildlife, the people, the communities, the cultures. And when you're on the receiving end of a gift, any gift, like what do? You give thanks, you give gratitude, and you give back. And it's that reciprocity that I think is so beautiful. When I first started spending a lot of time in Southeast Alaska, when I was working on salmon in the trees, I quickly learned that like my money was not very useful in Southeast Alaska, like currency, cash. But if I had salmon, like to trade or something, suddenly it's like, you can pay me in salmon. And likewise too, or it's like, oh, can I pay you to take me, somewhere? And they're like, no, but, or not with cash, but you can pay with salmon. And I had a lot of stories. People would tell me, it's like, my hairdresser will not take cash, but will definitely take my smoked salmon.
Yeah.
Or, to get my gutters cleaned or something, I pay in salmon. And I mean, it is valuable currency.
It is. I have a tribal brother, Joe Williams, who I believe you've met and spent time with. And Joe, to this day, since probably the day I met him in 87 or 88, sends me his home canned salmon in a glass jar every year.
And you just cry.
Oh, and I mean, and he's an indigenous fellow, Tlingit. And it's so valuable. But, I have to kind of maybe go down a path of why Alaska. Because as you and I have shared, my father, who grew up in the 30s in Everett, Washington on the Snohomish River, he worked on a shingle mill, and he used to tell me, Danny, this river, during salmon season, you could walk across the backs of the salmon and get across the other side. There were so many salmon. And in his lifetime, that dwindled to just very little today. Alaska became a state in 1959. The first act of the state legislature at that time was to abolish fish traps, which were wiping out the salmon runs. And since then, the salmon runs actually came back in a big way. And I think this is the part that you're talking about if salmon is it's a formidable creature and can return given the right environment. But as you look at Alaska today, and we've seen some good successes in salmon come back. We're kind of troubled with our kings in particular right now. They go way outside our waters in their 5 years. What do you feel are some of the challenges, even in Alaska, where salmon runs are still, for the most part, relatively strong?
Right. It's interesting because when I was working on this book, I spent some time with scientists and fish biologists and was kind of asking those same questions. And one woman in particular, I think, helped me look at Alaska kind of in a little bit of a different way. She said, historically down in the lower 48, we lost salmon due to the 4 H's, which was, habitat destruction, hydroelectric dams, over-harvest, and then substituting hatcheries for habitat.
True.
And then David Montgomery of Kind of Fish, one of my heroes.
Yeah, well, we're going to be talking again as well. Yeah.
Fantastic book. He includes a 5th H, and that's history, and not learning from that history and repeating those same mistakes. And, it's interesting because, you go to Alaska and it's, there's very little in the way of hydroelectric power. Over harvest kind of depends where you are and, kind of your worldview. But I think I think the state's done a pretty darn good job of managing salmon, making sure that enough escape, getting caught, and get up to those spawning grounds so they can make more salmon. Habitat destruction in parts of the Tongass, definitely. And then habitat, hatcheries, there are some hatcheries, there's, some issues there. But for the most part, as this one woman scientist told me, she said, it might not be the 4 H's that are really going to impact salmon, but it's going to be the 4 C's. And those were culvert. So like on the Kenai Peninsula, like that whole Cook Inlet watershed there.
Right.
All of those roads were built without salmon passage in mind. So a lot of those culverts don't work for salmon. So culverts play a huge role. Culvert climate. Climate's a big one.
It's a big one
that
these
is
days.
just the giant elephant in the room. And the thing, that's going to impact the salmon the most with climate, well, a few things, but water temperature, like we talked about earlier. Salmon are cold-blooded creatures. They do not like hot weather.
No.
And I'm right there with them.
Me too.
I love this weather, but it's like, don't get any hotter than this.
It gets a little hotter than 80, and I'm not happy.
Yeah. I'm like 72.
Yeah.
But for a salmon, it's like 55.
Yeah.
Like their water temperature's got to be 55 or cooler for them to really thrive. So, so it's the water temperature. Again, it's the right amount of water at just the right time. The timing of all that. There were a few years ago when I was up, it was 2019, when Alaska had record temperatures like all throughout the state.
I remember it.
There were spawning streams that didn't even have water, period. I mean, that's how hot and how dry it was. So anyway, climate's a big one. It'll affect the snowpack and the timing of the snowpack. But culverts, climates, connectivity, just making sure, again, because, salmon have this gauntlet of things that they've got to run, from everything in their freshwater system out to the ocean, get all the way back, all that thing.
Yeah.
All that has
Predators.
To be connected.
Yeah.
So it's all got to be connected, connectivity. And then the last one is compartmentalization. And what she meant by that was you've got like Alaska Fish and Game manages the salmon themselves, but then like the U.S. Forest Service is managing the forest, and then there's state lands, and that's a whole different agency, and then like NOAA and NIMS, and that's a federal agency, and they're kind of doing ocean stuff, and it's are all these groups talking to each other and sharing?
How are they collaborating for the greater good?
Yeah. So it was super interesting to think about that because again, we never want history to repeat itself. And I don't think history will repeat itself as far as the 4 H's in Alaska. I think we've learned enough down here.
I would concur.
But it's all these other things, particularly climate. Climate's a big one.
Well, and that's, we talked about king salmon a little earlier, and the king salmon goes out for 5 years, way outside Alaska waters. And, when they used to go down to California, the water was 55 degrees or cooler. That's not happening anymore. And whether by bycatch offshore or warm water, I don't think they know fully, but it appears to be both.
I think, I mean, from everything I've read or everyone I've talked to, it's water temperature, it's the acidity, of the ocean, and then that's affecting the food source. It's, I just read a really scary article, we're deoxygenating the ocean. So not only maybe is it too warm and too acidic, but now there's not enough oxygen. It's like, that doesn't bode well for any ocean creatures.
No.
But particularly salmon.
Yeah.
But I still look north, to Alaska, with incredible hope, though.
Do you want to sing the song for us?
Yeah.
I will.
I think you'll do a way better job.
Oh, come on, Amy. North to Alaska. Don't you know the rush is on?
See, you're going to do a way better job. But I still have a lot of hope because it's still there. We're not trying to bring something back from the dead.
Right.
And we're not trying to convince people to bring something back that they don't even know that they lost.
Right.
I mean, those are our big challenges here. In the lower 48. Those are huge.
Yeah,
right there.
the primary habitat is intact. in Alaska, the primary.
Yeah, it's intact, and people have relationships.
Right.
They have very deep, meaningful relationships that they really want to continue, and they want their kids to have.
Yeah.
So people are, and they're well aware. It's not like people don't know like what the threats are. This is the other thing I find ironic. It's like, okay, here you've got, this place that's relatively thriving still with wild salmon. Yes, there are issues.
Sure.
But relatively compared to everywhere else in salmon's historical range, they're doing okay and well in some places. And yet the threats to them in Alaska are bigger than they've ever been.
True.
I mean, as far as like the development that we're seeing, the whole scale mining, whether it's in Southeast Alaska on those transboundary rivers that are originating in Canada and drain into Alaska, the Pebble mine up in Bristol Bay, which we defeated that one in January too. But that's not permanent.
It has a chance to come back and rear its head.
Exactly. Or in some other form, right? On the Susitna River, they keep talking about putting in a giant hydroelectric facility, on that dam. It kind of never ends, like all of these proposed developments that would impact salmon.
Well, thank goodness that you and I are vigilant, and those that we know are vigilant.
Yeah.
And I think that is a big difference also. I think that, today from 40 years ago, night and day, the people that are here to assure that things aren't going to go down in a bad way without a fight.
Right.
And we've seen that with the Tongass. I'm curious, though, to kind of switch subjects. The big question that I always get when I'm out on my boats or when people call, they want to know about salmon, they want to know about fishing, they want to know about where they can see salmon spawn. And, we try to get people out to where they can observe spawning creeks and this kind of thing, and which brings the bears in and all this. But I always get the question of, if you had to pick a species of salmon for dinner, what would be your favorite?
Oh, for me?
Yeah.
King. Absolutely. Yeah.
Any more detail on that?
Well, king salmon are the largest.
Yep.
They've got the most fat content, oil, which gives them that delicious, yummy flavor. But for me, a king salmon, like right out of the smokehouse.
Yeah.
So it's still warm and it's still so moist and it just melts in your mouth. I mean, it's like butter. You don't put anything on it. I mean, I'm always like shocked in horror when you see like, salmon with cheese sauce or salmon with garlic and pesto.
Right.
Not that can't
I've done
be
it myself.
No, I know.
Yep.
Not that, especially pesto. That can be good. But it's like, that fish is so incredibly delicious all by itself.
Yeah.
It's like, I just kind of feel like you're doing it a disservice to smother it with something even stronger, like cheese or garlic or something like that. Anyway, I really like, for me, it's king for sure. Sockeye is my second. But really anything just fresh right out of the water is going to be good. Even a pink salmon.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are like, pink salmon. Pink are the smallest, so they don't have all that oil and all that fat content. But right out of the ocean, they're pretty darn good.
Yeah, I agree. I would fall in your camp on the king, although I would add white kings.
Oh.
What, 2%, 3% of the entire population of king salmon have a genetic difference and come back with white meat. Mm-hmm. I think it's only because I can't really tell the taste difference.
Right.
But I think it's only like, I hate being normal. I just hate it. And everything I do, I don't want to be normal. And so I have to like white king salmon. But the other, and I've just been experimenting with this lately. Years ago, I did a taste test aboard one of our boats, and I had all 5 species of salmon, and it was a blind test, and I found that it's really more about the preparation.
Yeah.
But lately, I've been going, because I felt like I deserved to try this, is I've been buying whole kita, which is, we used to know it as dog salmon when we were young.
Yeah,
they call it kita today. Yep, chum, and another name for it. And I've been roasting an entire salmon, and usually around 6 to 8 pounds, and basically munching on it over about a week and a half period.
Oh, wow.
And I have found that even Kita salmon, by the way, which is $6.99 a pound, I'm amazed at how good it is. And it's a late run generally too, which means I can get fresh Kita later. So, the salmon connoisseurs are all looking down their nose at me like, oh, that can only be used for animal food. But I love it.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know. You're seeing Kita show up a lot more in restaurants.
I think they're doing a better job. I mean, when it was chum or dog, who wants to have a chum or dog salmon? So they're marketing it better.
Yeah.
So looking back in your mind's eye for a moment, if you were to describe to me your most precious salmon encounter, the thing that when you kind of think about everything you've done in Alaska and the Northwest to help bring the salmon to light, the thing that was most meaningful to you that just kind of hangs in there. And I'll tell you mine, just because mine's crazy. But it was a life experience. It's not romantic. I was a young captain in Glacier Bay, and I had a pregnant wife and a young child, and we lived on our sailboat inside the bay, anchored up, and the pink salmon came in a massive school right underneath the dock at Bartlett Cove, and all the lodge employees came down, and we were catching salmon right and left, and I had maxed out my sick salmon, I was just releasing hooks so people could fish, and there may be 30 people fishing this. It was a harvest for sure. And I remember all of a sudden realizing that there were a lot of people without licenses and saying, hey, we got to stop. This is getting out of hand. It's going crazy. And right then I got hit right in the neck with a hook that was being casted. The woman later, Becky Crosby, was a captain with me for many years. She was the one that nailed me. And afterwards, she felt so bad because I had obviously this barb went in and I still have a scar. She came in and she basically came out to our boat and she rode out and she, in amongst the pink, she managed somehow to get a beautiful, chubby coho. And she brought it out to me and it was freshly caught right from there. We felt good that we all had kind of shut down what was getting out of hand and getting to be, from a really fun time to carnage. And she brought me that salmon, and that night I had it with my family, and it still holds as, I don't know, maybe because it was partly stopping something that was getting out of hand and then being gifted something and having the hook in the neck. It was all just a lot of emotion flying. So that was my favorite salmon experience.
That's great. That's great. I have many, but I think there's two I think I could really speak to. When I was working on this book, The Salmon Way, and again, really, I was trying to meet with as many different people as I could. I didn't know any of these people, and I'm trying to show up at their busiest time of year. Because it's really important to me because I'm a photographer as well.
Yeah.
I need to be photographing them, doing whatever they do with salmon. And I'm asking a lot of people that they don't know me. We don't have a relationship. I'm showing up like this is kind of their make or break time of year. Whether it's making their living or putting up their winter food, they're busy, really, really busy. And they can't really just, take time away from that to sit down with a stranger.
It's the height of their year.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So anybody who did go out of their way and take time to meet with a stranger, I was already eternally, grateful.
Yeah.
To them. And so I was up on the Kuskokwim River. So this is part of the YK Delta, the Yukon-Kuskokwim River, where salmon are not doing well. This is like one of the places in Alaska, especially the Yukon River, all out collapse of chum salmon. The king salmon haven't been doing well for probably 15 or so years up there. And then the Kuskokwim, the year I was there, it was real iffy as to if they were going to get to fish for kings at all. Kings again are they're bigger. They fill smokehouses. They fill bellies. They fill winter, freezers. They're really important. And so it was real iffy. And I was upriver probably like 200, over 200 miles upriver from the mouth of the Kuskokwim. And they had just opened fishing for subsistence folks, mostly native people in the villages there on the Kuskokwim. And so people were really, really grateful. They just had like one day they were able to, start to fill the smokehouses. And so I was meeting with a family there, and I was just really getting an idea of just how important these salmon are, to them. This is their winter food.
Yeah.
And a lot of us don't really understand that. People who grew, I grew up with grocery stores.
Right.
As one woman told me, said, "You are store dependent." And I never heard that term before. I'm like, I am. That doesn't sound...
It's very apropos.
I know, but it doesn't sound like real secure either.
Yeah.
I'm store dependent.
Rely on others. Yeah.
Right. Like we all found out during COVID, what that meant, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, but to these families, I mean, the salmon's everything. This is their store. That river is their store, and if the fish aren't coming up, that's, they're not going to have salmon for the winter. So I was really getting a feel for this. I was in their smokehouse looking at all these gorgeous fish, hanging before me as they're tending to them. And at the end of my stay there, one of the daughters, who I think was about in her 20s, very pregnant, just about ready to have a baby, and she was talking about the importance of salmon to this baby and then to this child's future, and wanting to pass all this on and everything that she had learned from her mom, who had learned from her mom, and just the importance of this and how important these fish are to everything to them. And as I'm getting ready to leave, she takes 2 jars, like you had said, the smoked salmon in a jar that they had done themselves, and places them in my hands. And this is after I really just understood how important these fish are, and that I am clearly store dependent, and I don't need these salmon. And I was so touched, and she just places them in my hand, and I'm salivating, but at the same time I'm hesitant. It's like it didn't feel right for me to take these salmon because they're just not. I don't need them, like her family needs them, and I said thank you, but I don't feel right, taking these. Now that I know how important salmon are to you. And she just pressed them into my hands, and she said, sharing is also important to us. And I mean, there's something in me just like, something in me just hit, and it's like, this is so much more than salmon.
Yes.
This is a relationship. And
it's lifestyle.
A way of life.
Yeah, way of life. Yes, and the right way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, and sharing, the salmon make that possible. When you think of the thousands of years, especially for indigenous people, whose entire cultures revolve around these fish, in times of scarcity, they would share. Nobody would make it if you weren't all sharing the little that you had. In times of abundance, of course, people share. But it's really in times of scarcity, I think, when those communities and those cultures would come together. And it was salmon that salmon bring them together. Salmon create this spirit of generosity. Salmon create these communities. They create cultures. And this was another question I asked everybody I met with for this book. I said, so what would your life be like without salmon?
Ooh.
And pretty much everybody, right? Ooh, right? Like people got a little, that's a lot of people like, ooh, don't even ask me that question. But I pressed it. Everyone pretty much said the same thing. They said, without salmon, we'd probably find a way to go on and adapt and do whatever, but there would be no community. Like that's what salmon do. Like they bring us together, they keep us together, they hold us together. So just those 2 jars in my hand after learning how important those fish are. And the other thing, when people give you salmon that they have caught, prepared, smoked, frozen, however it is, and they're putting it in your hand, they're not just giving you fish. They're not just giving you food. They're giving you a part of themselves.
Exactly.
And they're
so powerful.
Anything more, loving and caring and powerful that 2 human beings can have that interaction.
Well, and they prepared it. They caught it. They prepared it. And they stored it. And all the things, the heart and soul that went into it.
Yeah, and how much time and work. And so, when she, I said, I don't think I can take this. And she said, no, sharing is just as important to us. And I was like, oh my gosh. So that's one that really sticks in my head, because then I came back to my own life. It's like, what do I share?
Yeah.
Like, what do I have that's a gift that I feel like is a gift that just shows up, right?
That is great. That is a great look inside, isn't it?
Oh,
when
yeah.
those kind of events come into our lives that change us personally.
Oh, it's so changed me, because it's like, again, what do I have in abundance, that other people could benefit from and that would appreciate? And, I think of gardens, people grow their gardens. And, it seems like, whenever zucchini time comes around, it's like we're all trying to offload zucchini. So I kind of think that doesn't really count, because it's like people are leaving 40-pound zucchinis on your doorstep.
Yeah.
I mean, it counts, but I don't think it's the same. But I started...
It's a small measure.
Yeah, but I started looking around, and we have fruit trees at my home, and it's like, I need to do something with those apples, and so I press cider and I leave that on people's doorsteps, or I make applesauce and I give that to people whenever, there's my jar of love and time and thinking of someone else, that's going. I call it Nettle Nation, the forest where I live is just teeming with nettles. And there's so many things you can do with nettles. So harvesting, drying, making pesto out of those. But that's all from salmon and learning, being around people who have relationships and are sharing that fish with people. It's definitely impacted how I think about, my own food for sure, but then my own community and what am I doing? So anyway, so that's one story. The second story, I think I was on Prince of Wales Island in Southeast, and I was on a salmon spawning stream in August. Salmon are coming in, right and left. There are bears all around. I'm wanting to kind of photograph all of it. But when you are on a salmon stream and there's bears all around, you really got to be paying attention.
Absolutely. It's a tense time.
It is very tense. And for the most part, the bears are there for the fish. They're not there for me, but I can't get in their way either. And so I've got my eyes pressed against the camera. So it's, right. I've always have kind of one eye pressed against the viewfinder and one eye kind of looking around for bears. And at one point there was just this lull in bear activity. All of a sudden there were no bears. I'm like, oh, yay. Now I can try and photograph the salmon. They're really hard to photograph. Even if you've got 1 million of them in front of you, it's just hard to make an image that kind of shows that abundance. So I'm trying, and I'm way into this now, and I'm focused, and I don't know what it was. I didn't hear something, but I just felt there was something weird. And I look up, and sure enough, there's a bear really close, way too close for comfort. And at that point, all you can really do is just keep your wits about you and just, try and remain calm. And, running's out of the question. And I'm like, oh, God, this bear's way too close. But then I was looking at the bear, and it's like, the bear's doing pretty much the same thing I'm doing. It's focusing very intently, looking into the water. I mean, he's looking to catch the salmon. I'm looking to photograph the salmon. But it was kind of at that moment, I've always thought of myself as kind of a witness to nature, and a witness, kind of this observer, this neutral observer that's not really part of what I'm witnessing, but I'm removed, I'm separate from it. And it kind of took me being virtually shoulder to shoulder with this bear, and we're virtually doing the same thing, staring intently into the salmon stream to make me understand. And again, it was this feeling, it's like, I'm not just watching this, I'm a part of this. And we're all a part of this. We're not separate from nature. We're not separate from the Tongass National Forest. We're not separate from salmon in the trees. If we're separate at all, it's just in our mind. But everything that we need to survive, everything we need to survive, we are a part of all of this.
Yeah.
And it was just that, I don't know, call it an awakening, or again, another aha light bulb moment for me.
I think awakening is the right term.
Yeah.
Because if we can have those experiences, and hopefully we just hold on to that, don't let it die, right?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. But again, for so long, I just considered myself separate from all that. It's like, there's me and there's the Tongass. There's me and the salmon. There's me and the bears. It's like, no, we are all a part of this. And how can we, people like you and me, who know this and feel this and who are out there in it all the time, it's like, how can we help other people understand that, and you do an awesome job because you're taking people to these places and you're helping them feel it. It's not enough. I don't think it's not enough to see it. You have to feel it.
I agree.
And
it's
you can't
that experiential thing that is so important.
And you can't feel it if you're not there.
Yeah.
Right. or the next best thing, hopefully like if we're talking about it, like this, or if I'm giving a presentation, or hopefully maybe somebody reads something in my book and it's like, oh, wow, okay, we're not separate. So I don't know. That's the only way I really know how to help other people know this, that we're a part of the whole world.
I'm going to have to add another thing to your title, that. I mean, I have advocate, I have naturalist, I have, home scientist. I mean, I can go down the list, environmentalist, savior of the Tongass. And now I'm going to have to just put something like teacher of homespun, love for the wild.
Yes.
Maybe you're getting to be the storyteller. I love this. So Amy, you've got 2 really wonderful books out, and now speaking as an author. How can folks that are listening tune into you, learn about what you're doing, get a hold of your books? How can they contact you? What's the best route?
Probably the best way is just through my website, and that's my name, amygulick.com. So amygulick.com. The books are Salmon in the Trees and The Salmon Way, and you can buy those anywhere that books are sold.
Fantastic. And what's on the docket down the road? Another book coming?
It's a good question. It's funny. I always say, a book is like giving birth, only you're pregnant for, in this case, 5 years. In the case of Salmon Trees, it was 3 years. And then, like once the book is birthed, you don't abandon it.
Yeah.
Now you've got to raise it and get it out into the world and make sure it's like a functional part of society. Yeah. So, to take on another one is like, whew.
Yeah.
So I'm percolating on that one.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure. But I will say, Salmon in the Trees came out 2010.
Has it been that long ago now?
Do you believe it?
Oh my God.
Do you believe it? We're on we're the 3rd printing is coming out soon.
Yeah.
Mountaineers books, by the way. And this one came out in 2019, so just a year before COVID lockdown. But I am still like, what I love about these topics is they're timeless. I mean, salmon, again, are, as long as we have them, right?
This will be relevant 100 years from now.
Yeah, and I'm still giving talks. I'm giving talks in September, kind of on the Snake River issue, but, related to these. I'm still asked to give presentations, which is great. I mean, I absolutely love talking about salmon and how important they are to people and the ecosystems that they're all a part of. So, for me, that's never going away. What the newest thing is, I don't know yet. So this is a passage from my book, The Salmon Way, and it's about a conversation I had with an Alaska Native woman. And I think this really got me going on this book. It was the conversation that we had really sparked some ideas and some questions in my mind that I hadn't really thought about much before. So the conversation, it's in the book, and it's called Priceless. Stroking a thick white mountain goat hide placed next to a loom, I watch master weaver Terry Rothgar create a robe traditionally made from the animal's wool. Next to the hide are strips of spruce root, raw material for her exquisite woven basket, also on display. Terry tells stories about her Tlingit raven ancestors as her expert fingers weave a beautiful design. With such plentiful resources in your homeland, it's easy to see how your ancestors thrived, I say to Terry. Resources? She replies. Mountain goats and trees aren't resources. We have relationships with the goat and the tree. Since time immemorial, Terry tells me, her people have lived along the forested coast of what is today Southeast Alaska, rich with spruce and cedar trees, mountain goats, salmon, bears, ravens, and eagles. To make items using spruce root and cedar bark, the people carefully harvested the roots and bark so that the trees could continue to live. Today, weavers use the same harvesting techniques. They knew the optimal time of year to hunt the mountain goat, so the animal's coat was in the best condition. In addition to mountain goat wool, they also used the hide, horns, and meat. I wonder how Terry's ancestors thousands of years ago had the foresight to harvest bark or roots in a way that did not kill the trees. The forest must have seemed endless and in a constant state of regeneration in the soggy climate. But this mindfulness speaks to the difference between resources and relationships. When people live with deep connections to the land, water, animals, and plants that sustain them, it's impossible not to respect and develop relationships with trees, goats, salmon, and more. Resources, on the other hand, tend to refer to end products. It's tough to have a relationship with lumber, copper tubing, or frozen fish sticks. So it was really that conversation that got me going and really got me thinking about this difference between resources and relationships. And it just made me really want to ask a lot of questions and made me want to explore what these relationships that people have with salmon are like throughout Alaska.
Well, you did an excellent job of it. Thank you so much for reading that. That was really special. I'm sitting here just kind of feeling a little mushy as you're reading.
That's good. Mushy's good.
Indeed. Is there anything else that you would like to share that we haven't hit on, or just some topic that's burning that you got to talk about?
Oh, there's always those. But I think just, a huge thank you to you and thank you to everything that you do, again, to get people into these places where they can feel. I've been on your boats many times, as a speaker, and nothing just gives me greater pleasure than to just kind of hang out in the background and listen to people's conversations or watch their reactions when they just pull out of the harbor for the first time.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a couple I'll never forget. He was speechless, just looking at, he just said, "I've never seen trees like this." And he was just looking at again, the mountains are just covered with trees, and it was a beautiful evening, and his reaction was the same the entire trip. It's just quiet and just jaw dropped, like pretty much the whole time. So it's really fun for me to see, and really gratifying to see people just so blown away by this part of the world, that I don't want to say I take it for granted, but I guess maybe I do. I love it too. I'm very grateful every time I see those trees and the mountains and the salmon, but I've seen them enough to where it's not new. Again, I'm still in awe all the time, but not like those first timers.
Yeah.
But it's so heartening. And that's, to me, that's what you allow people to feel.
It's kind of like a first love thing. Almost. Those first months or years of love and how it's just so exciting and new and fresh. And I agree with you. And personally for me, it's probably why I do what I do, because there is no greater joy than getting people out there. And we know that when we get people out there that they see things, it changes their heart and their outlook. And we're in a better world because of it. So
it's pretty neat when, it kind of sounds unrealistic or maybe romantic to say, I have one life-changing experience. But experiences being in a place like that are life-changing. And I think in ways maybe we don't even quite know either until maybe you go back home and you're just like, things I was stressed about, that really, that's not such a big deal. I've just been to the most gorgeous place on the face of the world. It's like, that's what matters, right? Like, those are the important things.
Yeah.
And just how that makes us feel. So pretty cool.
That's what matters. I think that's a great way to end this cast. That's what matters. And I love those words. So, Amy, thank you so much for coming and joining me in my Seattle office. It's good that we collided down here. I'm normally in Juneau, but hey, good that we're here.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah, and look forward to seeing you get up north. Let me know when you're in Juneau next.
I will.
And we'll carry on. And I think for all of you that have been listening, extraordinary time with Amy. I mean, you talk about heart and soul and putting one's life's work into bettering the world for all of us. That's Amy. And I think we can all be humbled by her dedication to what she's fallen in love with and what she believes the world needs going forward. And I totally support you in that.